Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. My name is Ahmed Al-Badri. I'm an Nintex MVP for K2 in the Middle East and Africa for the year of 2021. Thank you for taking time to view this video. Today we will be doing a technical demonstration of automating our first process. This video is a complementary, it complements the series of articles that I've written on the Nintex community, in addition to the first video which we've shared recently around creating your common reusable objects that would help you excel and rapidly increase delivery of automating your corporate processes. So the process of demonstration today, or what we will be demonstrating today, will be the applying for a new or the renewal of your company badge or ID. It's a very simple process which would include a form for submission of your request, an approval process by your manager, and a notification email to yourself as a requester, informing you of the final outcome of your request, whether approved or rejected. So the first thing that we'll be doing is we'll be logging into K2 Designer, which I have open right here. The K2 Designer, as you can see on the left side, we have our categories. Under the Nintex MVP category or folder, I've created a folder for myself called Ahmed Al-Badri. Under it, I can see two folders, one called the Process Common, which is, we've discussed in the last video. This constitutes of three main entities, one which is our management views with things that we need to manage our process, such as creating a new process in our database, the name of the process, the description of the process, the idea of the process, and so on and so forth. The common views, which constitute of the action view, the action history view, the attachment view. We've gone through all of these in our last demo, and how these reusable views can rapidly speed up our delivery. And obviously our common objects, which basically link with our database, and how we use these to store specific data related to our process. For the sake of this demonstration, I've created a folder called Request for Employee Badge. The Request for Employee Badge is where we'll be storing our custom-related objects and views for this process. The first thing that we'll be doing is, after creating the main folder, which is Request for Employee Badge, we'll be creating subfolders by going to New and New Category. We'd create Smart Forms. We're storing our Smart Forms. We'll create another folder for storing our Smart Objects. A third folder for storing our Smart Views. And the last folder I've already created called Workflow. Usually I like to start with building the workflow so I can visualize how the process would look like. And then we can start building our objects, then views, and finally the forms. So I've created a workflow simply by going to Workflow, New, and Workflow, and give it a name. I haven't configured this workflow yet, so we'll start off by configuring our workflow. So as you can see, when you log here, the workflow canvas looks something like this. The green play looking button is basically configuring the trigger of our workflow. So the trigger of our workflow here, as you can see, this is called the start event. So how we want our workflow to start. When we configure our initiation form, we would link one of the rules of the initiation form to the start event. And then on the left-hand side, these are the elements that we can use in our workflow. So we have the tasks, notification emails, decisions, splits, merges, timers, the end of the workflow, and so on and so forth. So usually what I like to do first at the beginning is, if I press plus on the context browser, I have something called variables on the right, which basically represents my parameters. I will be using parameters in this workflow, and the most used parameter is something I like to call process instance ID, which is basically the ID of the instance that I'm running. So process instance ID is a number data type. So what I will be doing right now is, first of all, visualizing how my process would go. So somebody would submit a request. Once he submits it, then the workflow triggers. The first thing that it needs to do, obviously, is it needs to update the status of the request. So from the left-hand side, if I go to Smart Objects, and I go to Nintex MVPs, Ahmed Al-Badri, Process Common, Smart Objects. This is the process instance table, which is one of the common objects we discussed in the last video. This carries the status of my request. So I just drag it and drop it in the canvas, open it from the right-hand side. And what do I need to do? I will need to update the status of my request. How I update the status of my request, basically I would use the save method because I'm saving the status. And I would press on the input mappings with a plus. And what am I using? What ID or row ID in the database am I using to update this? This is the process instance ID. And this process instance ID, I would take it from the context browser in the variables and drag it onto here. So it knows which row in this database table to update. And then I press on the plus sign again, and I put this status. So once I choose the status, now what would be the status before the manager approves my request? I will say pending manager approval as an example. And this would update the status in the database table. And the next thing that I would need to do is I would need to pull in a task, which looks like this. I would need to configure the task, obviously. So I would go to the right-hand side at the bottom, the properties. I would give it a name. So let's call it manager approval task. And on the top here, I would choose the actions that the manager can do. So let's say for the simplicity of the process, to make it very simple for you guys to understand, I would use approve, reject, or both. So let's say both. I can create any custom action that I want, but for the sake of the demo, let's choose approve and reject. And I can either send the email notification out of the box, which K2 sends out, or I can customize my notification. So I can come here and say, for example, request number, and for example, I can pull in the process instance ID, which is the request number, and I can say for your approval. And here I can come say, dear participant, request number, process instance ID for your approval. And I can say, dear participant, your employee has applied for a new renewal of his or her company ID. You are kindly requested to action this request. And the work list item link here will be basically what would have the link to the actual form. We will come to this at a later stage where we can take a look at it further. We can even customize this through HTML tags if we want to have our own format, but we can discuss this later. We would connect the process instance SOB to this task. And the moment we connect a task to a decision, it will automatically take the actions that we've defined for this action, approve and reject, as we can see on the right and the left. So what happens when this manager approves? As an example, again, we need to probably update the status of the request. So we will copy this process instance object, paste it here, and paste it here. And we can point to approve and reject here. We open the object to change the status. So here it would be approved. and on the left-hand side, it would be rejected. So after the approval or rejection, we probably want the system to send a notification email to the user informing of the status. So we pull in a notification widget, and we also put one on the right. So we can change the name of this notification email to approval email. And on the right-hand side, we can also change this to rejection email. We can put some text if we say here, for example, congratulations. And here we can say, dear, your request for ID has been approved. Thanks. And on the right-hand side, we can say, I regret, dear, your request for ID has been rejected. Because. And basically, they're both pointed to the originator, both of these tasks, which is to me for the sake of the demo, but you can point it to anyone that you want. You would point the object to the email. And finally, you want to close the workflow, so you can put this red looking square and connect these both to the red looking square. This way, our workflow is almost complete, pending the creation of the forms. The initiation form would be linked to this trigger, and the action form would be linked to the manager task. For the current time, we can save our workflow and we can deploy it. Okay, so it's deployed successfully. So now that we've created our workflow, the second step is we can create our smart objects. So it's very important to architect your solution before you go ahead and start actually building it. You need to probably do your functional and technical designs first. And basically, you don't want too many tables and you don't want too less tables. You want the exact number of tables so that your process performance and usability and user experience is not affected by the number of objects you're creating. So for the sake of this process, I've decided that I need two tables or two objects, one called the requester details, which stores the details of the requester, his name, nationality, national ID number, department, job title, telephone number, and the process instance ID to link each submission with a specific requester. And the second table or the second object would be the request details, which captures the type of request, joining date, when his current card expires, the building access, the acknowledgement, and the process instance ID to link it to a specific instance. So let's start by creating our first object. So we press on the smart object folder, we say new smart object. We can use a K2 smart box or an advanced smart object. For the sake of the demo, I'll be using the regular K2 smart box, which is easier and simplistic to use for this demo. If you have a standard SQL database, you can use the advanced smart object. It's kind of the same concept anyway. So I'll be calling this requester details .sob, meaning smart object. I can give it a description if I like, and I say create. It will create the container or the object for me. Automatically, the ID, which is the auto number, represents the ID in the database. I can start by adding the different columns that I have here. So I have name. Let me just copy name. The data type of name would be text. I can choose from a list of data types, including time, booleans, numbers, memo, which represents and varchar max in SQL, date time, and so on and so forth. So name would be a text. The second one would be nationality, which also would be a text. The third one would be national ID number. Now you can put national ID number as both text or number, but I prefer to keep it as text if it does not involve any calculations. Because if by any chance your ID number contains a character, then having the data type as a number could cause issues. Then we can use department, which is also a text. We can use the job title, which is also a text. We can use telephone number. Again, you can put it as a number or text. I'll just leave it as text. And the process instance ID, which is obviously a number. And I can say number. And I can say, OK, save, and finish. Great. So we have our first object created. Now we go and create our second object. And we call it request details. .sob. Again, it'll create the ID, which is our auto number, which is fine. We take the type of request. Is of text data type. Then the second one would be the joining date. The joining date would be of type date. Then we have our expiry date, which is again of type date. Then we have building to access, which is of type text. Then we have the acknowledgement. The acknowledgement usually is a checkbox with a true or false, so it'd be a Boolean. So if we go down here, we'll find yes or no, which represents the Boolean. And we have finally the process instance ID, which is a number. And now we save and finish. So now we have our two tables created. So now in 20 minutes, we've created, or 15 to 20 minutes, we've created our workflow and our objects, which is quite fast. Now we need to start creating our views where the rules will go. This will probably take a little bit more time. So the first thing that we need to create is our first view, which is our requester details view. So we need a view to capture the details of the requester. So we would press on the object itself. We'll say design a new view. We'll say requester.vew. And it's an item view, not a list view. So we say create labels and controls. So the fields are called controls in K2. These are a representation of what columns are available in the database. And these automatically can communicate with the smart object field. So I would choose the fields that I want to show on the view. I want to show his name, nationality, national ID number, department, job title, telephone number. I don't need to show the ID or the process instance ID. The label position would be left, colon suffix if you want. And I want only 2 columns, which is fine. Now I press OK. This is how these are the fields or the controls that will show in the view. Now the name is obviously out of the box, it provides everything as a text field. I can change it. For a name, I would keep it as a text field. Nationality, probably I'll make it as a drop-down. So by pressing on the field itself and on the top here, I can change the control to, let's say, a drop-down menu. Now, when I change it to a drop-down menu, it expects me to either link it to a data source, which reads the nationalities of the different nationalities that I have, if I have a data source of nationalities, or I can create a static list of nationalities by going to data source type, and I can use static list of values in the control. If I press on the 3 dots here, I can add the nationality. So I have something called a value and a display. Display is only for visualization, what is seen on the screen. Value is what is recorded in the database. Now, if I were to use the elements of nationality in the dropdown in any conditions that I have, I will always need to compare using the values and not the display. This is a very common issue newbies face when they start using K2. Never compare in your workflow or in your forms, in your conditions, the display value. Always compare the value here. So nationality, for example, let's say is Australian. I'll just copy paste that. They can be of the same value. There's no problem with that. So American is an example. British. And so on and so forth. And we press OK. The national ID number, it's probably a text, so I'll keep it as it is. Department, maybe a dropdown again. So I can change it to dropdown. And I can add the different departments. So let's say the value here is IT, information technology. Here it's HR, and here it's called human resources. Finance, and for example, legal. And I can say, okay. The job title is probably text, and telephone number is text. So I think we're good now with the different controls here. Now we need to tell the system what to do when this view loads. So the first thing, and I kind of use it as a rule of thumb, it really applies to many of the cases. There are exceptions, but the first thing that I do on a view is I go to the parameters and I add a parameter, which is my process instance ID. And I choose the type number. So whenever, the reason why we do this is when the system opens this view, or whenever we load this view, whether by itself or through a form, it needs to do a specific action. So when I'm using it part of a specific process, when I define the process instance ID in the view, the moment the view loads, it will look to see if there's a parameter, and it will load the values from the database or show me an empty screen. And this will make more sense as we go. So when I add the parameter process instance ID, I go to the rules, I press on add rule. The first rule that I would do is I would type in the events. So I have the events column, the conditions, and the actions. The events are the triggers of, or the trigger. The conditions are what are the necessary criteria that needs to be met to implement a specific action. So the trigger is when the view is opened. So if I type the word view, I have something called when the view executes a method, and I choose from the method something called initialize. This means when the view is opened. Now, when the view is opened, what do I want it to do? The first condition I need to check is I type the word parameter. When a view parameter has been specified. Now, I've only defined one parameter in my view, which is the process instance ID. What this condition means is if there is a process instance ID that is passed to this view, then I need you to get me the details from the database. Now, in the way I develop, I only issue the process instance ID or initiate the process instance ID after I submit the request. So that number or request number is only generated after pressing of submission. So when my manager opens the form, which includes this view, the view, once it opens, it will find a request number because obviously the manager is opening it, and it will go looking in the database for the value of the controls so that it can load the data I submitted on the screen. So if the view parameter process instance ID has been specified, then I need to go to my folder, objects, and I need to go to the requested details view to load the information from the database. So I go to requested details smart object. I use a method called list or get list, and I configure it. And I pass the parameter from the requester view, the process instance ID which we created, And I filter out from the database. This is the database, process instance ID. I say, go filter the database using this request ID and get me back the name of this person. These are my controls on the view, my nationality, my national ID number, my department, my job title, and telephone number. Now, what if the process instance ID has not been specified, i.e., this is a new request. Somebody's just opened the form and he wants to submit a new request. So I can use in the conditions an else, because I've already used an if. So the else would be the negation of the if. So if this becomes false, then it comes here. So else, what do I want it to do? I might want to load the name of this guy from the Active Directory as an example. So I would say else, I go to actions and I say transfer data. Transfer data, configure, I would go to system values on the right here, to the current user. This is reading from Active Directory, and I would take display name and I will put it in name. Same thing you might want to do for job title, telephone number, nationality. They're probably all stored in your Active Directory, but for since I'm using a test user, I'll just use the display name for now. And I press OK. I press OK. Save and finish. So our first view has been created. As you can see, it's checked out. I check it in and I move it to my Smart Views folder. Now I need to create a view for the request details. So I press on the Smart Object Request Details and I say Design a New View. And I say request.vew. It's an item view. Create labels and controls. I choose the type of request, joining date, expiry date, building to access, acknowledgement. It's left, colon suffix, and I say OK. So the type of request, again, would probably be a drop-down menu. And I change it to new. So we have new IDs and we have renewals. And we press OK. The joining date is a calendar, which is fine. Expiry date is a calendar, which is fine. Building to access probably is another dropdown. So let's say B1, which is building 1. We have B2, which is building 2. And B3, which is building 3, as an example. Now, I'm assuming in this demo that he can access only one building. But if he were to access more than one building, dropdown wouldn't be the right choice. You would have to choose from your toolbox on the left-hand side. You would use the checkbox list, which can allow multiple selections. Dropdowns and radio buttons only allow one selection. So for the sake of simplicity, we'll just use the dropdown for now. And the acknowledgement, it's a checkbox, obviously, which is absolutely fine. Now, again, we go to the parameters. We create our process instance ID. It's type number. Rules, add a rule. In the events, we choose view. When the view is initialized, it's the same thing. We check if there's a parameter. And if there is a parameter, we execute a smart object. Request details. We use the getList method. And we pass the parameter of the process instance ID. And we get back the type of request, joining date, expiry date, building to access, and acknowledgement. We don't need an else statement here, because if there's no submission, then it should just be empty. It shouldn't fill anything from Active Directory. We press on OK. Now, we might want to add something else here. So under the acknowledgement, we might add a data label. So on the toolbox on the left, we add a data label. We can call this data label acknowledgement label and or acknowledgement data label. We can give it a text. I confirm the accuracy of the information provided. As an example, we can wrap the text. And obviously you can play with the formats, the colors, and so on if you like. Let's just change the format. Let's say font. Let's make it Arial. The size 7, bold as an example, and on the left side. And we'll say OK. Right. And then that's it. We're done with our second view. We check it in. We pull the second view and we put it under Smart Views. So we've created our 2 custom views now. Now, the third thing is we need to create our form. So we go to our Smart Forms, new form, and let's call it ID request initiation form. Initiation form.smf as an example. Create. Now, the first thing that we do in our header, in our initiation form, we need to pull in our common views first. So we'll pull in the header as an example. We'll pull in the attachments. We'll pull in the initiation, which is the one that has our submit button. I think that's enough for the common views. And for our custom views, we'll pull in the requester details just under the header. And then our request details, which goes under the requester details. So now our views are making up our form. We press on each view to make it uncollapsible. We don't want the user to collapse it. And we can give each one of these a name. So here we can call this requester details view. This one is called the request details view. This is the attachments. And this one, submission, as an example. Okay. Obviously, you can change the formats, the widths, and many other things. The parameters, we don't need to define a parameter here. Now, in the rules, we go to when the form is initializing, we need to create, in the header view, we need to pass the ID of our process. So in this case, the ID of our process, we've created a the process ID is 5. And in the initiation view, we will do the same thing. The process ID is 5. And that's all we need to do in the when the form is initializing. Let me just double check that the process ID is 5. So in our last session, we discussed in the management views. Here you can add the process information at the beginning. I've already created it. Yes, the process ID is 5. Going back to the initiation form. In the initiation form, we're done with the form is initializing. We've added the parameter process ID in the header and in the initiation view. Now, we go to the second rule at the bottom, which is on initiation view, when the submit button is clicked, this is coming from the common view that we created in the common objects, the reusable objects. So what we need to do here is we need to, first of all, put a validation. A validation means defining, we move it up. So this one basically defines what happens or what are the mandatory fields that I have. So I have 2 columns on the right, the required and the validate. The required means what are the mandatory fields, and the validate will validate against the data type. So if you've defined a field as a number, whereas you're inputting a character, it will highlight it in red to show you that there is an issue. So here, let's make everything mandatory. So I'll just right click here to make everything mandatory. And the request details, I'll make everything mandatory. And I say the attachments are optional. And here I'll say, okay. Now the second thing I want to do is probably I want to make sure that the acknowledgement is ticked. So I go to the conditions, I write advanced condition. So if the form passes validation and I go to my request details view to the controls, I pull the acknowledgement. So if this is equal true, so tick means true, not tick means false. Then I wanted to do a list of things. So what do I wanted to do? The first thing I wanted to do is execute another rule, which is my process initiation rule, which is the rule that generates my process instance ID. After I generate the process instance ID, what I wanted to do is I want to transfer data. I want to transfer the process instance ID to all the views. So I go to the initiation view on the right, control parameters. I take the process instance ID, pass it to the header, pass it to the requester details, pass it to the request details, pass it to the attachment, and that's it. Then I want to save any attachments if there's any attachments. So I execute another rule. And I use the save attachment rule again, coming from my common view called attachments. And then lastly, I need to execute a smart object which saves my information or the submission to the table. So first of all, I need to write to the requester details table, which will save the information about the requester. So I'm creating now. So I go to requester, controls, I pass the name, nationality, national ID number, department, job title, telephone number, and I get from the initiation view the process instance ID. I can get it from the initiation view parameters or from the view parameter itself, because since I transferred the data, it's the same. And I do the same for the request details. I go to the request details smart object. I use the create method. I go to the request view, controls, and I pass type of request, joining date, expiry date, building taxes, and the acknowledgement, and the process instance ID. This way, this submission will be mapped to the specific process instance, so I can retrieve it later. After all of this is done, it will create in the database the action using the common object, and it will show a message of successful submission. The last point, which is once I link it to the initiation form, it will add a workflow rule here. So I'll press OK. I can either add it manually or through the workflow, but let's do it through the workflow just to make it simpler. I go to my workflow. Let me check this in. I'll go to the workflow. Okay. I go to the green looking play button. I start with a form. I go to Nintex MVPs, Ahmed Al-Badri, Smart Forms, and I pick up my initiation form. These are for references. We're not going to use them for the current time, so I'll just press on the red button. Next, help me configure it. Do I want to create a state or use an existing state? This is for more advanced workflows with many tasks, so I'll just use an existing state, the base state. When do I want to start the workflow? I don't start it when the initiation form is initializing. I start it when the form is clicked, or when the submit button is clicked. I say next, it will check out the form and add the rule, start workflow, okay. And now I deploy it or save it. Okay, great. Now I go to the initiation form, I will find that when the button is clicked, they've added a workflow rule. I can see it here. Now I need to start the workflow before I show the message, just in case if there's any issue, it wouldn't show that it's successfully submitted. So I start the workflow. Now, when I start the workflow, what I need to do is I need to pass two things to the workflow. I need to pass from my initiation view in the parameters, I need to pass the process follower which was generated, which is the unique identifier, and the process instance ID, which was generated to the variables we created in the workflow, or the parameters process instance ID. This way, I'm passing the ID, the instance ID to the workflow. And then I'll pull that instance ID from the workflow to the action form so that the data can be retrieved. And I press finish. I press OK. And I press finish. And this way, my initiation form is complete. I check it in. Now I can copy the name of the initiation form, go to Smart Forms, New Form. I go to Action Form. Now in the action form, the standard common objects that I need, or common views that I need, I would need the header, obviously. I would need the process instance view, which is a summary. It summarizes the status of the request. I need the attachments. I need the action history. And I need, finally, the action. And I need both my custom views, so the requested details go under process instance. And I need the request details view, which would go under the requester details. I make everything non-collapsible. Okay. Now I can start working on my action form. So I go to parameters. I need two parameters, one called process instance ID, obviously, because I need to read the instance from the workflow, and this is of number. There will be another parameter created here, which the system will automatically create, called serial number. The serial number is a unique identifier for a specific task. So the system will create it automatically when I link this action form to the task. I can create it by myself, or I can allow the system to create it. For the sake of the demo, I'll allow the system to create it. And then I go to rules. So the first rule that we need is when the form is initializing. So when the form loads, what I needed to do is I need to read the data that was submitted. So I would press on the first line, I'll go to actions and say, open a work list item. Now you might have a work list item means a task, basically. If I press here, I need to move it to the top before the views load. And I'll go to workflow. Let's say this is our only task. We take it and we say configure. So what do I need it to do? I needed to get the serial number. Okay, so we need the serial number here. Let me just add the serial number manually for the time being. So I'll just say serial number text. It needs to be exactly the same spelling, guys. So we go back and we say open a work list item. We choose from our workflow the task manager approver, configure it. We choose from the parameter serial number, and we choose from our action view, the controls, we choose the dropdown that stores the actions. And then in the output mappings, we will take from the data fields, this is reading from the workflow, the parameters, we'll pass the process instance ID everywhere on the left-hand side in the parameters. So the form and the views that have the parameter process instance ID, we are passing the process instance ID from the workflow to them. This way, the rule that we've put in each view, when the view is initialized, if it's the instance ID is specified, then it will load the data from the database. And this way, the manager can read the submission that was submitted. So it will load the values from the database. Okay, perfect. Just to make sure that all of these views have received the instance ID, you can press randomly configure to see if there is a process instance ID specified here. If there is, then you're good. Yeah, great. So that's the first thing we do. Now, we can either manually type in the work list item rules, but let's link it to the workflow. Let's link this form to the workflow, and it will include it for us by itself. So if I go to request company badge, edit, if I go to the task, similar like I've done here, link the initiation form, I'll link the task to the action form. So I press on the document looking icon. Instead of basic task form, I'll say smart form, and I'll go choose my smart form, which is the action form we created now. Again, I don't want to use references for the sake of the demo. Show me the settings. Use an existing state, correct. When the form is initializing, correct. So I will need this task is when the form is initializing. Yes, next. Okay. Okay, I think it's added. And I say deploy. Okay. I go to the action form. So it should put in a task now related to the manager. Okay, I think it didn't accept it. Let's try again. Sorry. Okay. Okay. Regardless, I think there's a minor issue with the browser, but it's the same concept. What would happen is basically you go to the action form. The form is initializing. Okay, here at the bottom, the moment you link the form, it should give you something like this. So if you type in the conditions, if work activity is specified, it will automatically pick up the work activity manager task. So if it's with manager task, you need to pass the serial number. And you need to open a work list item. Which means basically open the workflow. You pass the serial number. You take the action drop-down menu from the controls. And when he opens it, obviously you don't want him to be able to edit the submission. So specify the edit controls, which is from here. And make the header read-only, process instance read-only, requester view read-only, request details read-only. Just keep the attachments editable and the action editable for him to edit. And press OK. Okay. Now, the next thing that we do is we go to when the button is clicked. So now we know when the form opens, what happens. Now we need to check what happens when the form is clicked. So when the button is clicked, execute log action history rule. So log action history rule, which is this rule here. Right. What this rule does basically is it creates the action in the database of actions. So say if the manager approves it, it will put the action approved by this guy on this date and time in the database. What else do we need it to do? So we need to, obviously, if he approves it, we need to have something called when the workflow activity is specified. Again, here you don't really need it because you only have one task, but if you have multiple tasks, this is useful. So if the workflow is with the manager, we pass the serial number and we action a work list item. Action a work list item means move the workflow, basically. We choose our task, and when we move it, we choose the serial number, and we choose the action name at the bottom here. What else do we need to do when we action the work list item? We need to execute a, for simplicity, I'll just keep it as action work list item and probably save the attachment if he chooses to add an attachment. So execute another rule, and I'll say save attachments. Okay. Now we've added this rule here in the log action history, but before we want the workflow to move, before we execute the log action history, we need to make sure that he's actually chosen an action before he presses submit. So it needs to say, if the form passes validation, meaning if the action dropdown is chosen, then execute the log action history rule. And that's only when we execute the log action history rule. Else, we say, for example, show a message error, you have not chosen an action, or something of the sort. And then we press OK. Okay. So this should define our actions. Now, then we have our read-only form. So we go here, form, and we choose, and we type in read-only form, SMF, create. Again, we probably need our common headers. So that's our header. We need our process instance, which is our summary. We need our attachment read-only view. We need our action history view. And we need our action view. No, we don't need an action view because this is the read-only form. Because it should be read-only, it shouldn't be editable. The workflow is done. And here we add the requester under the process instance, and we add the request view here also. We make it all uncollapsible. We give it names to the view, so request summary, requester details, request details, attachments, and action history. And here we define our process instance ID, because that's what we will use to retrieve the data. And when the form is initializing, edit rule, we transfer, the first rule is we transfer the data to all the views, which is the process instance ID. We take it from the form parameter and we transfer it everywhere in our views so that all of them can retrieve the data. And we press OK. We make sure that they've received the process instance ID. Yep. And then finally, we say specify edit controls, which would basically, we need to make everything read-only because this is a read-only form. Okay, excellent. And then we say finish. And we check it in. Now let's give it a run. So we go to the initiation form. As you can see, it's loading from Active Directory my display name, which is developer1, as it's a test user. So I can change it if I want. Let's say Ahmed al-Badri. Nationality, I can open in the drop down here, Australian as an example. National ID number, let's say 457. Department, Information Technology, Human Resources, Finance. Job title, I don't know, IT Manager. Telephone number 1456. Type of request new. From this date, that date, building to access building 2. And I confirm the accuracy of the information, yes. I can add an attachment, so press add in here, test, and please approve. Submit. Okay, your action has been submitted successfully. Your request number is X. Now, the manager should receive an email, and he should receive the task also. So the manager has received an email, as you can see here. Your request number 41 for your approval. Your employee has applied for a new ID. You're required to action it. You can open it from here. So I open the form. It loads the data that I have submitted. As you can see in the header is the name of the process, the summary, which has the folio, the name of the process, status, the data was submitted, the details that I just filled in. Everything is uneditable, the acknowledgement. And I can see in the action history, it's been initiated with the comment by this user, which is me, my user ID and the date and time. I can action it and just say approve or reject. So if I don't approve or reject and I press submit, then it will say you have not chosen action. If I press approve and submit, it would send an approval email. If I press reject and submit, it would send the rejection email. Before I take action, it's also we also need to show you in the workspace. In the workspace here. So in the workspace, this is your workspace. This is your inbox. We can see also the request number here. So you can either take an action from here, from your workspace, or you can do it through basically pressing on the link on the email. It's kind of the same thing anyways. So if we go here and say, let's say rejected, not enough information. Then we press submit. Now, obviously you can navigate to another form, but we'll just see what has happened. As you can see, he's received an email, K2 service, we regret your request ID has been rejected. And basically that is it. So I'd like to thank you for taking the time to join and see your first process being automated. This video will be shared on YouTube and the Nintex community site. If you have any questions or you need more clarifications, feel free to reach out. Inshallah, we will respond to you in due course. Thank you for your time, and stay aware of more videos, inshallah, to come with more complex process to unleash the powerful capability of K2. Thank you, and assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.